5:15 a.m., December 28, 2014. Juanda Airport, Surabaya, Indonesia. 155 passengers and 7 crew members are boarding an AirAsia flight on a routine hop to Singapore, one of the world's busiest airports. Air traffic controllers assign the flight the call sign Wagon Air 8501.
Wagon Air 8501, good morning. Wagon Air 501, good morning, join the tower, go ahead.
At the helm is Captain Irianto, a 53-year-old former fighter pilot with more than 20,000 flying hours under his belt. The co-pilot is 45-year-old Frenchman Remy Emmanuel Placel. He's flown over 2,000 hours. Also on board is 22-year-old trainee flight attendant Karanisha Haidar Fauci. The planned route from Surabaya crosses over the equator through latitudes that are home to the world's most destructive weather, known as the Intertropical Convergence Zone.
It's the hottest place on the planet, I think, is the sea surface temperatures in the Intertropical Convergence Zone. That means there's lots of moisture going into the atmosphere from the ocean. Water vapor is the fuel for tropical storms. It's where the energy comes from.
Although it's warm air that creates storms here, when it reaches high altitude, temperatures within the clouds drop dramatically to as low as minus 112 degrees Fahrenheit, as cold as winter in Antarctica. Inside the operations center, the weather is constantly monitored.
Itu tidak ada kondisi yang mengkhawatirkan. Ramalan cuaca atau prediksi cuaca pada hari itu di Surabaya tidak ada masalah. Tetapi di Singapura yang kami terima tafornya memang ada kondisi hujan ringan.
The forecast is clear, but that could change at any moment.
Basically, it's the bread and butter of the pilots flying in the tropics, is that they are always, on virtually every flight, flying around thunderstorms.
Juanda aircraft ready for start and push back.
The plane is an Airbus A320, one of the most technologically advanced in the skies, and the world's best-selling single-aisle airliner.
Wagon Air 501, clear to Singapore, Mike 635, level 240 initial.
This plane has flown 13,500 times, covering more than 23,000 flight hours.
Wagon Air 501, clear to takeoff.
Passengers and crew settle in. 25 minutes into the flight, the plane is cruising at around 32,000 feet, now operating on full autopilot.
A lot of the time, the plane is being flown by the autopilot. It's a normal flight. There's nothing abnormal about the situations or the scenario we're in.
The Airbus 320's autopilot system consists of 7 computers.
Airplanes are like computer games nowadays. There's a lot of pilots that will just engage the autopilot as soon as they're climbing to altitude and not touch it till they come home. And they can do that. It's literally that easy.
As the plane approaches the equator, storm clouds are brewing over the Java Sea below.
Severe storms can go from very small storms to very large, dangerous storms in a matter of just a few minutes.
You can see a thunderstorm ahead of you or below you, and in the very few minutes you take to get there, it could have climbed several thousand feet above you.
Air traffic controllers receive Flight 8501's final radio transmission. The plane requests permission to take a left turn and climb.
Air traffic control will know where other aircraft are, and they either allow you to do the turn or they don't. Sometimes they may delay your turn until another aircraft has passed.
Several nearby aircraft have already changed course to avoid flying into the heart of the storm.
Some of them deviate to the left, there are some deviate to the right, some flying higher.
With so many flights in the same airspace, air traffic controllers deny 8501's request to climb above the storm.
To be denied a climb, very normal. It happens on virtually every flight, because there you'll be passing through aircraft flying in the same direction as you, because it's always better to fly through weather than it is ever to hit another aircraft.
With the possibility of severe turbulence ahead, the crew face a critical decision: to stay on course or change direction.
This aircraft was the only one at 32,000 feet at that time. The other aircraft flying around the same air routes were at 30 to 38,000 feet.
This animation shows the flight path of the plane's final minutes, halfway into its flight to Singapore. At 6:16, radar data records that the plane is cruising at around 32,000 feet. Seconds later, still cruising. But then, the plane deviates from its course and turns left.
You would have been flying it with the autopilot, and so you put changes to direction by turning a knob, as opposed to actually flying it with the joystick.
The 155 passengers on board have no clue that they are just 2 minutes from disaster. December 28th, 2014. An AirAsia flight to Singapore is flying into a thunderstorm. Modern airliners are designed to withstand the turbulence produced by severe weather, but a thunderstorm is not a place any pilot wants to be.
Fear. Definitely fear. There are no pilots who fly through a thunderstorm who don't experience fear. But you overcome that because you have a job to do.
The guidance was you're going to encounter some thunderstorms. They didn't know how severe they would be. They didn't know precisely where they were going to be. So you don't know until you get into it. And then when you get into it, sometimes it's too late.
A massive thunderstorm is the ultimate hazard for the crew of an airliner. In the last 50 years, bad weather has been a factor in over half of fatal commercial air accidents.
I mean, there's so much energy that's being released in a storm like that. It's just chaotic. It's dangerous. It's turbulent.
And there's an added force of nature to contend with: total lightning.
Total lightning is both the cloud-to-ground lightning that we're all accustomed to seeing when it hits the ground, but in severe storms, there's 10 times as much lightning that is up in the cloud.
At 6:16, radar data records that the plane is cruising around 32,000 feet. But then the plane turns left, and for reasons as yet unknown, it climbs steeply.
It would be dark, there would be lightning. The rain would be very noisy on the airplane, you would hear it.
The aircraft can shake, the instruments can become blurred as your head is shaking, the eyeballs literally shaking your head. The responsibility is awesome. You've got the lives of many people on board. You don't actually focus on that when you're flying. And, you know, that's the honest truth. What you're thinking about is your own safety of flying the aircraft as it's supposed to be. And if you look after yourself, you're going to be looking after everybody else on that aircraft.
And it's not just the pilots that are pushed to the limit.
When a plane enters severe weather, it will be exposed to forces all around the aircraft, which are pushing it in a particular direction. And that can be torsional twisting and unloading and loading stresses on the airframe.
The plane climbs through 37,000 feet. As it climbs, its speed slows to just over 400 miles per hour. Just 20 seconds later, the flight is around 38,000 feet. Then, it slows down even more. At 6:18 a.m., the plane goes missing from radar. Within an hour, air traffic control announces that they have lost track of the aircraft. Distraught families are desperate for answers. Airport manager Trikora Harjo prepares for the worst.
Demikian juga segala sesuatunya yang berkaitan dengan krisis center dari mulai sarana komunikasi, kemudian papan pengumuman atau papan informasi kami siapkan, dan juga kami menyiapkan informasi-informasi yang tentunya nantinya akan dibutuhkan apabila memang terjadi benar adanya atau lost contact.
Then, the news is made public.
162 people are feared dead after an AirAsia flight goes missing.
Within 3 hours, a massive international search effort is launched, led by the Indonesian military. Also in support are Australian, American, Russian, Singaporean, and Chinese search teams. With 30 ships, 3 warships, and more than 20 aircraft equipped with visual, radar, and sonar surveillance, covering a search area of 60,000 square miles of the Java Sea. This disappearance immediately brings back memories of an infamous unsolved mystery from the same region 9 months earlier. On March 7, 2014, Malaysian Airlines flight MH370 was en route from Kuala Lumpur to Beijing with 239 people on board. An hour into the scheduled flight, it disappeared from radar screens. The search effort was the biggest ever launched, but it failed to find the missing plane. What happened remains unknown. For 3 days, the world wondered if this would be another never-ending mystery. Could it be terrorism or a rogue pilot? But then, wreckage is discovered. All the evidence points to the plane having crashed into the sea. Everyone on board is dead. One of the first bodies to be recovered is the trainee flight attendant, Karunisha Haidar Fausi. Her funeral becomes a focus of national mourning. Unlike MH370, there's no missing plane here. The mystery is, how did this happen? 10 days after the first wreckage is located, there's a breakthrough.
The black box data recorder from the AirAsia plane, which came down off Indonesia, has arrived in Jakarta for examination.
As the recovery operation continues, experts around the world begin to ask, how can one of the world's most sophisticated planes suddenly drop from the sky?
We gotta know what happened. We have to know what caused it.
The first thing, the most important thing for the families is they want to know what happened. They want to know the truth. And of course, they deserve to know the truth.
The priority for the families is to ensure that no such disaster ever happens again. The official investigation is ongoing, but based on released information and expert analysis, it is now possible to explore the key factors which likely influence the plane's final moments, and this may change the way you feel about flying. Though the researchers have the flight's black box, it only tells part of the story. Investigators dig into the data to tease out the accident's origin.
We understand that there are 3 conditions that can cause the accident. First, the instrument, maybe the airplane itself, human error, and the last thing is the weather situation.
The first question is, what caused the plane to climb so fast? After cruising at around 32,000 feet, the plane turns left and climbs steeply. Just 40 seconds later, the plane is over 37,000 feet. 38,000 feet. That's a climb of nearly 6,000 feet in less than a minute. 3 times faster than normal and outside the parameters set by the autopilot. So was the plane out of control, or was it direct pilot action?
6,000 feet per minute is a pretty hefty climb at altitude, no less, when the performance isn't as good. It's possible that they pulled the nose up and traded speed for altitude.
That is possibly what happened, that the aircraft was climbed too steeply.
But there could be another reason.
It's possible that they got into an updraft and they were carried up by a bubble of air, basically.
It's very turbulent and very chaotic and very dangerous, and what goes up has to come down. So you have a massive updraft, and then you get a massive downdraft, and that's just a terrible scenario for a plane and a pilot. You don't want to go into that.
Experts have a good idea what happened after the plane got above 38,000 feet. The AirAsia flight must have stalled.
Most people understand a stall as they would when they're driving a car, and that would be the engine stopping. That's not the case with aircraft. An aircraft stalling means that the airflow has actually broken away from the wing, and the aircraft no longer flies at this point. It is literally falling like a dead weight in the sky.
The engine is still running, but the plane is falling. To see how this affects aircraft in flight, test pilot Dr. Guy Grattan is examining the profile of a wing in a wind tunnel.
In the wind tunnel, you can see the flow demonstrated by these lines of smoke.
At level flying, the airflow is steady around the wing. But then, as the angle of attack changes, just as it would in a climb, this happens.
You reach a point where the flow starts to separate, starting at the rear top surface, and then it breaks up completely. This is known as the stall.
Guy is going to put his skills to the test by pushing this plane to its limits and stalling it.
Aerodynamically, the stall happens when the flow has broken up on the upper surface of the wing and it ceases to lift efficiently, and that causes the aeroplane to fully or partially lose control.
This light aircraft is a Grumman AA-5, but the aerodynamic principles are the same for any plane, including the AirAsia flight.
If the aeroplane stalls, a good pilot should be immediately reducing the angle of attack and increasing the power to recover. If they don't do that, what's likely to happen is an increased rate of descent, and either the aeroplane will remain in the stall until it hits the ground, or the aeroplane can enter a spin.
For an unprepared pilot, the effects of a stall can be catastrophic. During takeoff in Afghanistan, after its cargo shifted to the back of the hold, this freight plane stalled. At this level, Guy is cruising, but at a very high altitude where the AirAsia plane was flying, all aircraft hit a point where speed becomes critical. It's an area known by pilots as Coffin Corner.
Coffin Corner exists at a high altitude, and to fly at those conditions is really very difficult because you've got to manage the speed of the aeroplane very, very accurately.
Every plane has a maximum and minimum speed. The complicating factor is the higher the altitude, the smaller the margin of error between going too slow and going too fast.
If you go high enough, what you do is reach a point where the stall speed and the maximum speed are very close together, and we refer to the aeroplane as being in Coffin Corner because if you go any faster, then you'll lose control or break the aircraft, and if you go any slower, you'll lose control of the aircraft. So it's a very vulnerable place to be.
Whether or not you're high up in a Coffin Corner or at low altitudes, a stall possesses a unique challenge for a pilot.
I'm just going to reduce the power, and then I'm going to hold the nose up. The effect of that is going to be that the speed's going to bleed off.
Anything below 60 knots risks a stall.
Okay, just closing the throttle now. You can see the speed is bleeding off now. At 65 knots, I've got a stall warner.
Could this be what happened to the AirAsia flight?
The airplane started to wallow. You can see the nose coming up. I've lost view of the horizon in front of me. At about 55, I'm about to lose it.
In the weeks after the AirAsia flight crashed into the sea, one thing emerged as a crucial factor: stalling.
Okay, just closing the throttle now.
Guy Grattan is investigating what a stall means for pilots, and that means losing control of his plane.
5 knots, I've got a stall warner.
The aircraft drops 200 feet.
The aeroplane has stalled, you see it pitch nose down, and I'm recovering the aeroplane from the stall.
To regain control, Guy dips the nose to gain airspeed, then levels out.
A very dramatic stall, if you're not expecting it, can be quite frightening. Might even lift off my seat and hit my head on the ceiling of the cockpit.
All commercial airliners are put through stall tests. But is this what happened to the AirAsia flight as it climbed too steeply? And if so, how did the plane get to this dangerous point?
Pilots are trained to recognize the stall. In fact, first thing pilots are trained to recognize is the approaching stall.
The captain of the AirAsia flight was a former fighter pilot with 20,000 flight hours under his belt.
Up above 30,000 feet, there is plenty of height to recover an aeroplane from a stall. So even if the aeroplane was stalled, that in itself doesn't explain the loss of the aeroplane.
So the critical question is, what other factors might have been at play? And to fully investigate that, we need to look inside the cockpit. Seasoned pilot Captain John Mahan is flying an Airbus A320 flight simulator, an exact replica of the lost plane.
The reason why we try to simulate what happened in an accident or incident is for learning and whether we can take that information forward to stop it happening again. And also finding out weaknesses in the system that can lead us into difficult areas.
Every reading we see, every indicator we see, will be exactly what the AirAsia pilots would have seen. For all pilots, accurate instrument displays are vital.
All aircraft are designed in such a way that they give you information, and it's our job and our profession to identify that information and prioritize.
The instruments are everything, and you ignore them at your peril. However, if you get an instrument failure, you have to be able to recognize it. If you follow a faulty instrument, then you can cause the aircraft to over-control, and at that point, anything can happen.
Flight 123, requesting climb.
This simulator has been programmed to reproduce an instrument failure while climbing from 32,000 feet.
That doesn't look right. It's like unreliable airspeed to me. Check that, please.
Captain, standby is indicating 0.72.
0.72.
The pilots scramble to identify the fault.
Current
checklist, unreliable airspeed. 396
Here,
knots.
it's an unreliable speed indicator.
Autopilot off. Flight director's off. Birdie's up.
Recognizing the fault, the crew switch off part of the autopilot protection, which hands the main controls back to the crew.
Courage checklist. Seatbelt sign on. Moving to seal. Master caution. Overspeed. Caution pitch.
Next, they switch off the computers related to the faulty speed indicators. Seconds later, this happens.
A stall warning is an indication that you are getting into an environment where you're about to lose your lift on your wing.
In an attempt to recover from a possible stall, John puts the nose down to gather speed and drops 5,000 feet, then levels out.
Wings, maintain wings level. Speed 370.
In this case, John recovers the plane successfully.
Maintaining 30,000 feet.
In the case of the AirAsia flight, we know that the Airbus 320 climbed rapidly and that it probably stalled at 38,000 feet. We also know that faulty instruments contributed to another tragic Airbus disaster and another stall 5 years earlier. On June 1st, 2009, Air France Flight 447 was en route from Rio to Paris with 237 passengers and crew on board. At 2:10 a.m., the Airbus 330 went missing from radar.
Un accident tragique.
It was 2 years before the flight's black box recorder was found and finally revealed its secrets. Colleen Keller is an air traffic investigator who worked on the search for Air France 447. The similarities with the AirAsia crash are striking.
It ran into bad weather right around the tropical conversion zone, right at the equator. The initial malfunction was caused by the computer shutting down.
On the side of the plane are metal cylinders that measure airspeed. They are called pitot tubes. The investigators discovered that the tubes had frozen over, causing the instrument readings to go haywire.
The computer literally said, "I can't function, I'm confused," and it shut down. After the computer shut down, the pilots were forced to hand fly the airplane in a very difficult area, which is very high altitude.
These are some of the actual words spoken by the pilots as recorded by the cockpit voice recorder.
Qu'est-ce que vous faites? T'as le contrôle de l'avion, là?
They had the throttles back and they had the nose up, so both those combined to make it start to go very slow. They pulled the power back because they thought they were going too fast, and that put the airplane in a stall on a steep descent, like kind of a floating down descent.
Unknown to the Air France passengers, the plane had dropped 10,000 feet per minute.
Probably most people were sleeping or trying to sleep. There was a lot of turbulence. The lights were dimmed, and it would have felt like that the whole way down. I don't think people realized what was going on.
In the cockpit, faced with unreliable instruments, the crew didn't realize that the plane was in a stall. If they had, the pilots could have recovered control. Instead, they continued to drop towards the sea.
Putain, va taper. C'est pas vrai.
Why did they do that? It's impossible to tell because we can't really get into the minds of the pilots who died there.
The Air France tragedy highlighted the fact that pilots need to have better basic skills. I think people were very surprised at the confusion in the cockpit. People think of pilots as being very professional, but they're just human.
Did the AirAsia flight suffer a similar fate?
One thing we're looking at, which is rather like Air France 447, is potential problems with the aircraft, which then confuse the computer systems, which then cause a very heavy burden on the pilots.
What could have forced these pilots to make a deadly split-second choice? Flight 8501's tragic final moments may have come down to something seemingly innocuous: ice.
Icing is a very big concern for all aeroplanes.
Icing can change the aerodynamics of the plane, but as we learned from Air France, it can also affect key systems.
There may well be an issue here about freezing of sensors.
Satellite weather data from the day of the AirAsia crash reveals incredible freezing temperatures in the clouds. At the top of the storm, it's nearly as cold as the coldest day in Antarctica, as low as -112 degrees Fahrenheit. This wind tunnel replicates flying through a typical cloud at a temperature of just -4 degrees. Here, a pitot tube is put to the test. If the heaters that are supposed to keep the tubes warm fail, this happens. Ice blocks the tube, which means in the cockpit, the readings the pilots receive could be incorrect. But with no suggestion from the AirAsia authorities that these airspeed indicators failed, it remains speculation.
The most plausible theory is potential problems with the aircraft, and then how the crew responded to what the aircraft was doing.
That the plane fell out of the sky is not in doubt. But what happened during its fall could shed light on the flight's final moments. In the weeks after the crash, there were reports that the plane had exploded before it hit the sea. Based on released information, this is what we can piece together. At an altitude of around 38,000 feet, the plane loses speed. Then it drops. Some experts estimate that at that point, it falls at a rate of 20,000 feet per minute, twice as fast as the Air France disaster, down to 24,000 feet, before all communications cut out. To investigate whether or not the plane broke up during its descent, Indonesian aviation analyst Jerry Sujatman is reviewing the data relating to the distribution of debris across the Java Sea.
I think it's pretty certain that the aircraft went down in one piece. The wreckage pattern does not indicate any breakups prior to hitting the water, so we just have to look at the wreckage itself. And the telltale signs of it is that, yes, the aircraft would go down tail first, hit the water tail first.
It's clear from the wreckage that mid-air structural damage is not a major factor here.
From what we hear from the investigators, from the cockpit voice recorders, that up to the last moment, they did put all their efforts into trying saving the aircraft.
The official investigation is ongoing. But one thing most experts agree on is that severe weather was a factor in both the Air France and Air Asia crashes. In the last 50 years, weather has contributed to over half of all fatal commercial airliner accidents. But there's one type of turbulence that doesn't occur in stormy skies, and it could affect all of us.
Anyone who's been on a plane at cruising levels, flying through clear blue skies, you'll know that it's possible suddenly to hit turbulence that the pilot couldn't see coming, so it literally comes out of the blue.
It's called clear air turbulence.
At the moment, there's no onboard electronics that can see it. The pilot can't see it. It really is invisible.
Inside pockets of air, wind direction changes suddenly and severely. It's been known to cause structural damage to planes and has caused injury and death.
The shocking truth is that an Air Asia type event could happen anywhere in the world today. There's still not the technology in place for controllers and pilots to make sure that they don't fly into severe weather.
Here at the University of Tokyo, Professor Suzuki is looking to change that.
I believe the air travel becomes safer and safer. However, we have to establish a new technology to overcome the weather conditions. Clear air turbulence is invisible, so it's very difficult for an aircraft. It can change the acceleration of the aircraft and attitude suddenly. It's very dangerous.
This device is designed to detect it. Behind this lens is a shortwave ultraviolet laser. It's a technology called LiDAR. It detects clear air turbulence by spotting currents of water molecules.
This is our LiDAR systems. It's prototype one. And this is an optical antenna. And this antenna can receive the reflection from a laser beam.
In flight tests, this LiDAR system detects the range of moving water molecules in the air at a distance of up to 18 miles. The aim is to develop a more streamlined onboard turbulence early warning system within years.
So there is a possible future there for us in which we could see fleets of airlines fitted with this technology, making encounters with severe turbulence a thing of the past.
There's one more advance being rolled out that is set to revolutionize our skies. And it might help prevent an Air Asia type crash in the future by tracking planes in real time. When the AirAsia flight crashed, scientists around the world continued their search for solutions to safer and more efficient air travel in the future.
It's just amazing to me how complex the airspace is. From pilot to air traffic controller, many different systems interchange information and data.
Our current technology is unable to track all those planes as they move around the globe.
I think that it was a shock with the recent tragedies that occurred, that people started to realize that the whole Earth is not covered, and there are vast amounts of oceans and mountainous areas that are not covered.
It's estimated that 70% of the world's airspace is out of the range of radar.
Currently, what controllers see when aircraft are crossing the oceans are a dot that was placed by an airplane reporting back, say, 10 minutes ago. And they know where it's supposed to be 10 minutes later. So really, there's a 10-minute gap, which is basically 80 miles apart. That's because there's no real-time surveillance or tracking of that aircraft in between.
Here at the Ariane facility in Virginia, engineers are changing that.
This is one of the most revolutionary advancements in air traffic control since radar.
66 Iridium satellites are readying for launch for full operation in 2018. The satellite network will cover the globe, receiving signals from every plane everywhere on the planet, relaying information to controllers on the ground.
Think of it as a GPS receiver on board all of the airplanes that transmits its precise location in real time to air traffic control authorities. By putting an ADS-B receiver on board each satellite, we realized that we would create something that was not possible before.
If this technology were available now, MH370 would have been better tracked, and the AirAsia flight would have been found within hours, not days. With second-by-second information, air traffic controllers will be better equipped for a quick response to pilots who need a sudden change of altitude. The AirAsia flight might not have been denied permission to climb to avoid a storm.
The altitude changes are important because a lot of those requests are a function of weather. So when the pilot says he's over a particular point and he's requesting to change altitude, the controller will have the screen to look at, and the pilot will have a higher rate of responsiveness from the controller based on the fact that they have a shared situational awareness.
Global tracking of flights will make managing flights safer and more efficient. But a critical issue remains. There's one unpredictable factor that's a cause in up to 80% of all air crashes: human error.
I think the public is wondering how safe flying is. People are afraid of airplanes crashing because the crashes are so horrific when they happen. A lot of people die at once, and they think about that. But truly, aviation is a lot safer than most other forms of transportation.
However safe day-to-day flying is, the fatal Air France crash tells us that too much technology in the cockpit can cause confusion.
You've got a very highly automated aircraft, and crews sometimes struggle to deal with the complexities of the automated systems, and they are not trained to deal in an emergency or difficult situation with manually flying an aircraft.
Are pilots becoming over-reliant on computers?
Pilots today have lost their skills. They're not hand-flying the aircraft as often as they have done in the past, and therefore when they have to do so, they're not as skillful doing it. And there's no question about it, because practice makes perfect. But overall, we're much better off with this automation.
The answer seems simple: more training and more experience at the helm.
Everybody knows that pilots should probably be flying manually more than they are doing.
Technological advances are seeking to keep up with ever-increasing demands for travel and making flights better able to cope with increasingly violent weather. But for the families of the passengers and crew of the AirAsia flight, their hope is that a tragedy like this will never happen again.
They want future accidents to be prevented of a similar type. And so it is vital that the causes are identified for what brought this aircraft down, and more importantly, that those causes are then acted on so that other families don't have to go through what the AirAsia families have gone through.
This